We are so happy that you've joined us today on this important anniversary because this is the day that Virginia passed what has to be one of the most important pieces of legislation ever in the history of the country, and that's the Statute for Religious Freedom. And one of the things that we'll be looking at today, as part of our tradition, about a decade ago, the Valentine took over responsibility for that corner of 14th and Carey Street. And as of today, our board is meeting to really begin to consider what's next. After a decade, it's time for us to dig in deeper to the ideas of that corner and to make it a place that people will have to come on their visits to Richmond. So we are lucky that we have Spouse today too joining us, and we're glad you're here. But before we start, I do want to think a little bit about what the statute is. And one of the things that the Valentine will be focusing much of its attention, I think, over the next few years is really looking at this particular period in American history when the capital moves from Williamsburg to Richmond, and what happens in the city becomes the country. When you think about it, a block from us is the John Marshall House, who invents the Supreme Court in many ways, and invents our government in many ways. And I think Jeffrey will talk a bit as we think about that. We think about another block away, and you have the White House of the Confederacy. And another block away, you have the Wickham House. That's a really important place because, as we celebrate this 250th thing, it's important for us to remember that not everyone believed that the revolution was a great idea. And to have that house as an opportunity to talk about dissent is really an important opportunity for us. And if you walk just a few more blocks, you see Jefferson's Capitol. And if you walk down the hill, you see Shockoe Bottom, the center of the domestic slave trade. So within this small area of the city, we have this unique opportunity to do a deep dive into what are these notions of equality? What does it mean to have an enlightened mind? The statute says, a mind free. What have we spent the next decade trying to understand that topic as we prepare for the anniversaries of the statute and for the anniversaries of our city and the moving of the capital to Richmond? What does it mean to have an open society, a civil society? What is, with Patrick Henry just a few other blocks away, what does liberty really mean? And so I hope that you will join us on this journey over the next few years because, we've gotten things in good shape at the Valentine, new storage, and now we have this opportunity to move out of that building and to think about what we can do to create a place, an important place in downtown. And so on our board is a special committee that is working on this. Austin, will you come up? Austin Jones is chairman of our committee that's working on. And Austin will be introducing our speaker. I am not, as tradition, going to read portions of the statute because I think you really need to read the entire document. So I want you, it's there in your program, before the introduction of the speaker, would you just take, this sounds like church, doesn't it? But would you take just a moment to read the statute? I think there are words there today that are so important for us to remember. There are things like, and particularly in the final section, I think is really important, that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions on the matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. And yet, we are free to declare. These rights are asserted as the natural rights of man. I think that those are the words for today as we think about our world, the government, all the things that are changing around us, that this is the anchor for the work that we need to do. So I'm glad you're here. And Austin, will you introduce our speaker?
Yes, I have the great pleasure. Good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the Valentine Board of Trustees, thank you to the Library of Virginia for hosting this event, Valentine staff for organizing today's event, and to all of you for taking time this morning to commemorate Religious Freedom Day with the Valentine, and especially to Mr. Rosen for making today's discussion special. Jeffrey Rosen stands as a towering figure in the realm of constitutional debate and legal scholarship. As the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, Rosen has made significant strides in fostering a deeper understanding of the U.S. Constitution. His role extends to hosting the acclaimed weekly podcast, We the People, where vital constitutional issues are dissected and discussed by experts from diverse perspectives. Rosen's academic contributions are equally notable. He serves as a professor of law at George Washington University, imparting his extensive knowledge to the next generation of legal minds. Furthermore, as a contributing editor of The Atlantic, Rosen continues to influence public discourse on pivotal legal matters. His illustrious career includes previous roles as a legal affairs editor at The New Republic and a staff writer for The New Yorker. Rosen's literary contributions are substantial, so I won't list them all. But they include his recent book, The Pursuit of Happiness: How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America, enriching the understanding of America's foundational values. Notably, his book, Conversations with RBG, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on Life, Love, Liberty, and Law, became a New York Times bestseller, reflecting his ability to connect with a broad audience. I suspect his new book, The Pursuit of Happiness, will similarly resonate with fans and critics. You can find it at your local bookstore or the Valentine gift shop while supplies last. Rosen's educational background is impressive, having graduated from Harvard, Oxford as a Marshall Scholar, and Yale Law School. His academic journey laid a solid foundation for his impactful career in legal scholarship and public education. Please give me the warmest welcome on this chilly morning to Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good morning. Hello, friends. It's so wonderful to be here in Richmond, and I've just had the most exciting morning upstairs. I can't imagine a more constitutional thrill than seeing the original drafts of the Virginia Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom and George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights. These are sacred texts in American constitutional history. Jefferson's bill was the cornerstone of the First Amendment, and Louis Brandeis invoked it when he wrote the greatest free speech opinion, I think, ever in the Supreme Court, Whitney versus California. And George Mason's Virginia Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom was the source both for the Bill of Rights and for that famous language in the Declaration of Independence about the pursuit of happiness. It was George Mason who first said that all men are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent natural rights, including the right of pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. And Jefferson had that language by his side when he wrote the Declaration. What I want to talk to you about this morning is my own quest and journey to understand exactly what Jefferson and Mason and so many other founders meant when they used that famous phrase about the pursuit of happiness. And that quest led me to an unusual COVID-era reading project to read the classical writers on virtue who inspired the founders. And I'll tell you what I learned and how it changed my life. It changed what I think about how to be a good person, how to live my days every day, and also how to be a good citizen. And it also changed what I think about how I want to work with the Valentine Museum and the Richmond Library and all of you to celebrate America's 250th anniversary. Okay, so here's the story of my COVID reading. It was a series of unexpected synchronicities that led me to figure out what the founders had in mind when they talked about the pursuit of happiness. In particular, I noticed that both Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson had chosen as the core definition of happiness a book by Cicero that I'd never heard of called the Tusculan Disputations. And here's how I encountered this book. First, I was rereading the part of Ben Franklin's autobiography where he describes how in his 20s he resolved to achieve moral perfection. And he made a list of 12 virtues that he later expanded to 13. Industry, order, temperance, prudence, cleanliness. He saves the one he finds hardest for last, and that's humility. Ba-dum-bum. And he makes a graph, and the virtues are on the x-axis, and the days of the week are on the y-axis. And every day he resolves to focus on a different virtue and to put an X mark next to the virtue where he's fallen short. He tries this for a while. He finds it's incredibly depressing because there are so many X marks, and he gives it up after a few weeks, but he thinks he's a better person for having tried. I knew about the project. As it happened, I tried it with a friend a couple of years ago. A rabbi in Washington, D.C. recommended that we try a Hebrew version of Franklin's 13 virtues, and not knowing that it came from Franklin, it's called Musar, which means character in Hebrew. People practice it today, and we tried it for a while. We also found it's incredibly depressing, even in Hebrew, and we gave it up too. But what I noticed during COVID is that Franklin chose as his motto this Cicero book, and the motto was, "Without virtue, happiness cannot be." A few weeks later, I was at the Boar's Head Inn here in Virginia, in beautiful Charlottesville, near here, a pay-in to Jefferson, and there on the wall of the Boar's Head was a list of 12 virtues that Jefferson drafted for his daughters. And I hadn't seen this list before, but they look a lot like Franklin's. They include resolution, resolve to do what you ought and do what you resolve. Silence, when angry, count to 10, when very angry, 100. So I was struck by Jefferson's list, but what really struck me was that when Jefferson was asked to illustrate the list, and when people would write to him, and he was old, and say, "What's the meaning of happiness?" he would send a passage from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations, the same book that Franklin had quoted. And it was a longer passage that Jefferson had copied out in his commonplace book when his dad died when he was 14. And it said, "He who has achieved a tranquility of soul, who is neither unduly exuberant or unduly despondent, he is the self-composed man of whom we are in quest. He is the happy man." Okay, so I thought, I've got to read the Cicero book because it was so important to both Franklin and Jefferson in their definition of happiness, not as feeling good, but as being good, not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. But what else to read? Then I found this golden reading list that Jefferson would send to anyone who asked when he was old how to be educated. And he'd send this to kids who were going to law school, and he'd send this to his friends who wanted to build a private library. And it's an extraordinary list, both in the breadth of the books that Jefferson prescribes and also in the schedule that he prescribes for reading them. First, the breadth of the books. And this is his letter to Robert Skipwith, if you want to check it out, and I hope you do check out the whole list. It includes literature. Jefferson loved novels, which he thought could teach us how to live, and poetry, and drama, and ancient history, and modern history, and political philosophy, and science. What caught my eye was the section that Jefferson sometimes called natural religion and sometimes ethics. It was a series of books of moral philosophy. At the top of the list was Cicero's Tusculan Disputations. It was like a secret key that I had to read. And then, on this list of 10 books of moral philosophy, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, Seneca's Letters, Epictetus, as well as some Enlightenment philosophers, Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding, Hume, Bolingbroke, and Hutcheson. What struck me about this list is that I hadn't read almost all the books on it. And I've had this marvelous liberal arts education, and I'm so grateful every day to the incredible teachers who taught me literature. I was an English major in college, and political philosophy and history and law. But I'd never read these books of moral philosophy because they dropped out of the curriculum when I was in college in the 80s. And in the 80s, I was yearning for guidance about how to lead a good life. It was the greed is good decade, and you do you, and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And I was looking for an alternative to the hedonism and materialism that were celebrated by popular culture, but also was unsatisfied by the Puritan theology that I was reading in college as an English major. And I was searching for an answer to the question of, can we lead a good life by reason and reflection rather than by hedonism or by pure religious authority? And what I didn't realize, because these books had fallen out of the curriculum, is this is exactly the question that the ancient and Enlightenment philosophers set out to answer. The other thing that struck me about the list was Jefferson's schedule. He says you've got to get up every morning before dawn, read moral philosophy for 2 hours, watch the sunrise, then political philosophy and history, then lunch, then astronomy, science, and other rigors, then some dinner, then Shakespeare and light classics, maybe a little bit of poetry for mild amusement, and then to bed 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. So I really don't know what got into me. I still can't believe I did this, but I decided to follow the Jefferson schedule. It was COVID, we had more time, and I felt I got to read Cicero. So I got up every day before dawn, read moral philosophy for 2 hours, watched the sunrise, found myself writing these sonnets to sum up the wisdom that I learned, which sounds incredibly weird, but it turns out all sorts of people wrote sonnets in the founding era, including Alexander Hamilton, Phyllis Wheatley, the first published black poet, the great Phyllis Wheatley, whose genius was acclaimed by George Washington and others, and then John Quincy Adams, another one of my heroes, who would wake up in the White House, read Cicero. His favorite book was the Tusculan Disputations and the Bible, write these sonnets, and go on his day. So that's what I did, and what I learned changed my life. First, it transformed my understanding of happiness, because I learned, as I said, that for the ancients, happiness was not feeling good, but being good, not the pursuit of immediate pleasure, but the pursuit of long-term virtue. But then I also learned, by reading all of this great wisdom, that by virtue, the classical philosophers meant something particular. Self-improvement, character improvement, self-mastery, being your best self, using your powers of reason to moderate your unreasonable passions or emotions so you can achieve that calm tranquility that Cicero talked about as defining happiness. And that distinction between reason and passion comes up constantly in the ancient and Enlightenment literature. It's like a secret key to the meaning of the pursuit of happiness. And for all of these documents, I would, it's such a marvelous time to be alive and to be a researcher. I just did word searches, plugging the phrase "the pursuit of happiness" into all these documents. And what's incredible is it's everywhere. This isn't some secret meaning that was obscure to the founders. It's in the Enlightenment sources. It's in the classical sources. It's in the Christian sources like Wollaston and Tillotson. It's in Blackstone. It's the very central definition of Samuel Johnson's 1755 dictionary, which everybody read. There are two meanings of happiness. One is hap, from the Old English luck or chance. The main definition is the contraction of desires so that we can rationally meet them. The citation is to Book 51 of Locke's essay concerning human understanding, right on Jefferson's reading list. And all of these phrases, when they use the phrase "the pursuit of happiness," talk about this antithesis between reason and passion and achieving the golden mean. And I learned that they got this from Pythagoras. Who knew that in addition to inventing the triangle and the harmonic system, if that wasn't enough, Pythagoras was also a spiritual sage who lived on Croton. As a guru and moral exemplar, he encouraged his disciples to engage in rigorous moderation in all things, eating and drinking. He was a adamant vegetarian, and he came up with a distinction between reason, which we locate in the head, passion in the heart, and desire in the stomach, and said we should use our powers of reason to moderate our passions and desires so we achieve the golden mean. Plato popularized Pythagoras' trilogy in his famous metaphor of the charioteer representing reason, who's supposed to align the noble and appetitive horses in front of him so they're all pulling in the same direction. And Aristotle sums this up in his chart about the golden mean. The Nicomachean Ethics is a central source for the understanding of happiness in the Greek sense as eudaimonia, which means good demon or good spirit. Jefferson, when asked the main sources of the Declaration, cites four philosophers: Aristotle, Cicero, John Locke, and Algernon Sidney. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics famously defines happiness as an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. Because virtue and excellence aren't self-defining, I had to understand that reason-passion distinction to see exactly what he meant in practical terms. And at the end of the Ethics, there's this famous chart called the golden mean. And Aristotle identifies a series of passions or emotions, and for each passion, there's an excess and a deficiency. So we're supposed to be not rash or insensible, but temperate. And temperance is one of the four classical virtues: temperance, prudence, courage, and justice. The goal in all of this is not to lack emotion. The Greeks are extremely humanistic about the centrality of emotions to our lives, but to avoid unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear, so we can achieve that calm tranquility that comes from achieving the golden mean. If you needed a modern, if you had to sum it up in modern terms, the Stanford marshmallow test helped me understand the whole quest. Remember that experiment at Stanford in the 70s? These researchers give very young kids who are like 5 years old a choice. If they want to have a marshmallow immediately, they can have only one. If they can wait for 15 minutes, they get 2 marshmallows. The kids who could wait did much better later in life. They had better impulse control. They did better in school. They were able to resist their immediate impulses to reflect on their long-term interest. And that's the essence of the wisdom tradition. All of the sources are essentially getting to that same point of sober second thoughts and calm tranquility and calm self-mastery. And coming to understand the pursuit of happiness not as a quest for highs, for exuberant rushes, for immediate pleasure, for hedonism or hedonic happiness, but instead for calm tranquility, for self-mastery, for moderation, as eudaimonian happiness was a game changer for me. It just helped me understand the understanding of happiness for most of human history. So that was my COVID reading project. It was really exciting to have my understanding transformed. And then I set out to ask, how did the founders apply these lessons in their own lives? They all talked constantly about the pursuit of happiness and the need for virtue. They're constantly insisting without virtue, happiness cannot be. How did they do? Well, I'll just tell you a few stories about the founders and their own individual efforts to achieve virtuous tranquility, because the best way to learn history is through storytelling, and the stories are so interesting. And of course, it's a mixed bag. They were human, and they were imperfect, and some did better than others. But what's so striking is how constantly they talked about their efforts to achieve virtue. I mean, we would talk about it as a quest for emotional intelligence, but far from being buttoned up about this, they're constantly talking about it in their diaries, talking about it to their spouses. They're beating themselves up for falling short of their ideals or coming up with self-justifications for their own hypocrisies, but they led mindful lives. And it was the thing they cared most about, because they were all hit over this, over the head with this as kids when they read this moral philosophy and were told that it was the most urgently important thing that they could do in life was to try to achieve virtuous self-mastery. So I'll just begin with John and Abigail Adams. And when they met and they were courting, they had both been reading Pythagoras, who prescribes that every night before bed, we should make a list of each other's faults. And unfortunately, that's what they decided to do during their courtship. Unfortunately, because this is not a good dating strategy. And Pythagoras or not, it's risky to make a list of your faults, in particular with John Adams, who's one of the most famously vain and self-regarding men of his age. You know, he's obnoxious and disliked, as they said in the musical 1776. Everyone thinks he's incredibly arrogant. Abigail soft pedals this in making a list of his faults. She says, "You're so brilliant that some people might possibly find you intellectually intimidating." That's her version of "you're unbelievably vain and arrogant." He has no similar scruples, and he replies, "Well, you should practice the piano more and read more, plus you're pigeon-toed." So, oh, indeed. So she, with great self-possession, responds, "Well, I'll try to practice more and read more, but a gentleman should not comment on a lady's posture." So despite this bumpy beginning, they go on to marry. They have one of the great intellectual and moral and romantic friendships of American history. And what's so striking is how constantly they're attempting to continue their quest for self-examination and to become more perfect. They take this out largely both on themselves. They're very hard on themselves. They're Puritans, after all, and on their son, John Quincy Adams. And if I had a hero of the founding era, it might be Quincy, because he was just so mindful in his effort to achieve moral perfection. And it really took a toll when he was a kid. I thought having a Jewish mom was challenging. It turns out that having a Puritan mom is even harder, because Abigail is constantly on his case. She's saying, "Master your unreasonable passions, work harder, drink less, don't look at ladies in the street." And as a result, he writes in his diary, which many consider the greatest diary ever kept by an American president. His life is a litany of his own sense of inadequacy and falling short. 35 years old, he's just turned down a U.S. Supreme Court appointment, and he writes, "I'm 35 years old, I haven't achieved anything. If only I had a little more self-discipline, I might have ended war and slavery." But he sets a very high bar for himself. But as it is, I'm squandering my time, and I'm going to the theater too much, I'm drinking too much, I'm just making a total hash of things. He, of course, goes on to great achievements. He's Secretary of State, he's president, and then he suffers two unimaginable challenges and tragedies. First, he loses the presidential election of 1828 to Andrew Jackson. And secondly, his oldest son, George Washington Adams, commits suicide, and he just can't deal with the pressure of being called George Washington Adams, and Adams is always exhorting him to be more perfect and sends him these letters from a Christian father to his son. It's just too much pressure for the son to take. He becomes an alcoholic. He jumps off a steamship. Adams is crushed. He doesn't know how he's going to continue. What does he do? He returns to Cicero. He rereads Cicero's The Tusculan Disputations in the original, because Cicero is a manual about grief. And Cicero wrote it when his own daughter Tullia died. And he's retired to his Tusculan villa, and he's trying to find the strength to overcome the greatest tragedies in life. And by surrendering the effort to control the thoughts and actions of others and only controlling what you can control, which is your own thoughts and actions, which is the Stoic dichotomy of control, Cicero prescribes, you can even deal with the greatest tragedies imaginable, including the death of a child. Abigail Adams thinks that this Stoic wisdom is too ascetic to really be practical. How is it possible that one could continue in the face of the death of a child and not feel grief? She says, "I would feel devastated if my own husband, who she, refers to in Roman terms. She calls herself Portia, and she calls Adams Lysander. If Lysander were to die, I'd be devastated. But I'll try." But Quincy finds the Stoic wisdom bracing in his dark night of the soul. And after a year of reading the Stoics and trying to overcome from his grief, he reinvents himself as the greatest abolitionist of his age. And he does this based on his reading of Cicero and also the Bible. He's a very close Bible reader. And there's a passage in the Bible where Jesus promises to free the captives and Adams concludes, this is his own original reading of the primary text, that this meant that slavery violates Jesus' will, and it violates the Bible, and it's damned to eternal damnation. And America will be damned unless it ends slavery. And based on that conclusion, Quincy Adams emerges as what Frederick Douglass calls the greatest white abolitionist of his age. And he introduces a constitutional amendment to end slavery when he goes back to Congress as a Massachusetts representative. And he denounces the gag rule forbidding the reading of anti-slavery petitions. And he resolves to end slavery, and with his dying breath, he votes against the Mexican War in Congress. He yells, "No!" And then he collapses on a sofa in Congress. He's carried to a couch. And his last whispered words are, "I am composed." And he gets it from Cicero, from that very passage that Jefferson had sent to everyone to understand happiness. The perfectly self-composed man is he who has achieved that calm tranquility that defines virtue and happiness. It's just extraordinary. So that's Quincy Adams. Let me say a little more about John and Jefferson, and then I want to say a bit about Jefferson because we're here in Virginia. Quincy Adams and John Adams and Jefferson reconcile. Remember, they broke after the election of 1800, where the country almost descends into civil war. Jefferson defeats Adams thanks to Hamilton's intervening in the disputed election on behalf of Jefferson and not Burr, who he thinks is a traitor. And Jefferson wins, and Adams skulks out of town, doesn't attend his inauguration. They don't talk for years. Abigail engineers a reconciliation. John sends to Jefferson a book of Quincy's essays on rhetoric and Cicero as a kind of forgiveness gift. And then they start to correspond. And their letters are just among the most moving and illuminating in all of American letters. What do they really want to talk about when they're old men and their politics are finished? They want to talk about spirituality and their quest for the pursuit of happiness through deep reading. And it's so inspiring to see their deep reading and so inspiring to see their sensitive understanding of the connection between the wisdom traditions of the East and West. And Adams is so excited when he learns that Pythagoras, the founder of Greek moral philosophy, may have traveled to the East and read the Hindu Vedas. And he thinks that if that connection can be shown, then it will be understood that the Stoic dichotomy of control, attempts to control the thoughts and actions of others, is almost identical to the central wisdom of the Bhagavad Gita, which is summed up by that passage that Gandhi used to quote: renounce and enjoy. Renounce attachment to controlling external events and enjoy eternal salvation. And Adams said, if we can just prove that Pythagoras met with the Hindu sages, we'll be able to prove that connection. The only thing is he's afraid that Joseph Priestley, who's just been writing a comparison of the morals of the Hindus and the Christians, didn't live long enough to complete it. And Jefferson says, good news, he lived, I'll send you the book. They're so excited to be able to make this connection. And Adams says, this will prove that all of the faiths of the world have essentially the same message, which Adams sums up in what he calls the hymn of Cleonth: love God and all his creatures, rejoice in all things. Jefferson says at the end of his long life, he's concluded he's no longer a Stoic, but an Epicurean. But by that he means not a hedonist. That's a libel on Epicurus by the Stoics. Epicurus, properly understood, argued that we should rationally contract our desires so that we could meet them. In other words, you don't forswear or try to overcome grief or pleasure entirely, but you just view things rationally. It's kind of the central lesson of cognitive behavior therapy today, which draws on the ancient wisdom, and that's Jefferson's mature philosophy and spirituality. It's just so beautiful to see these men who, they fell short on so many ways, but that youthful industry and the fact that they were such deep readers continues until they're old, and it's moving to see. And then, of course, they died together on July 4th, 1826, within hours of each other. Adams says Jefferson still lives, not realizing he died just hours before. But months before their death, they wrote, Jefferson wrote a beautiful letter to Adams where he said, I really don't feel like I know so little at the end of my long life, except that I love you with all my heart and soul. Very beautiful. Now, we have to talk about Jefferson here in Virginia and Jefferson and slavery. And I'm sorry to report that my reading in Jefferson left me even more convinced of the degree of his hypocrisy and racism, which was unusual even by the standards of the enslavers of that generation. None in that generation defended slavery as consistent with the Bible or natural law. In fact, all said that it was immoral and violated the Bible and natural law. And yet, Jefferson, in particular, always insisted that it should be ended at some distant horizon, which kept receding further and further into the future. For me, a really clarifying speech was one that Patrick Henry gave right after delivering the Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech, which he gave in a church here in Richmond, and a young Jefferson heard him give it. Henry says, "Give me liberty or give me death," quoting Addison's Cato, the Enlightenment source that was his and George Washington's favorite play. And then he notes the obvious hypocrisy. How is it possible that the colonists could be demanding freedom from slavery for the white men, but not for the black? And Henry says, is it not amazing that I myself, who believe that slavery violates the Bible and natural law, myself own slaves? I won't justify it. I won't attempt to. It's simple avarice or greed, says Henry. I can't do with the inconvenience of living without it. And that insight that slavery is immoral and wicked and violates the Bible and natural law, but I like the lifestyle and I don't want to give it up, was the essence of the hypocrisy of the founders. And in their moments of candor, they knew it. Didn't defend it, but just liked the lifestyle and didn't want to give it up. In classical terms, they talked about their own indolence as opposed to the virtues of frugality and industry, and always promised to do better. But they didn't, and they were addicted to this lifestyle. No one more than Jefferson, who praised the virtues of asceticism at Monticello, but in fact lived like a Caligulan emperor. He was a wild shopaholic who would keep going to France and buying these expensive gilded mirrors and tufted, armchairs and a fauteuil from Marie Antoinette's own ébéniste, and yet he denounced debt. The centerpiece of his political philosophy was the immorality of one generation imposing a debt on another. That's why he wanted a constitutional convention every 19 years. At the same time, he lived so wildly beyond his means that he freed only 7 people when he died, and 2 were his own kids with Sally Hemings, and she agreed to come back from Paris on the condition that he free their kids, and he kept that promise, and he freed some of their relatives, but no one else. And as a result, parents were separated from children, and the entire population had to be broken up to pay his debts. It's just an extraordinary degree of hypocrisy, and Jefferson knew it, which is why he said he trembled for his country when he knew that God was just. In addition to his hypocrisy about insisting that slavery should end but not freeing his own enslaved population, Jefferson had a racism that was virulent even by the standards of its day. And the Valentine Museum is doing such important work here to commemorize and memorialize the racist art that was designed to defend the system of slavery in the antebellum period. And Jefferson's racism is most dramatically expressed in his reaction to the great Phyllis Wheatley. So Phyllis Wheatley shows that you don't need to have a Harvard education, as John Adams was privileged to have, in order to be inspired by the classical sources. Phyllis Wheatley is a young teenager who comes over enslaved from Africa. She arrives in Boston. Her mistress, the wife of the guy who bought her, decides that she should be educated in the schoolroom along with their kids. And after just a few months of studying Cicero and Seneca and all the classical writers, she begins to write these inspired poems of virtue. And her poems are so inspiring talking about the need for self-mastery, of Christian perfection, as well as denouncing slavery, that she is acclaimed by all of the founders. And Washington acclaims her genius and receives her poetry with respect. And it's acclaimed throughout the city of Boston. She's so powerful that the city of Boston decides to hold a trial about whether or not she wrote her own poetry, this extraordinary convention of the great sages of Washington in a panel chaired by John Hancock, the guy who signed the Declaration with big letters, with Cotton Mather and all the Boston literary figures, conduct some kind of examination for her on the depth of her classical knowledge. And Professor Henry Louis Gates imagines questions like, who was Cicero, and name the 9 muses. And she passes with flying colors. This examining board attests that she wrote her own poetry, and she becomes an international celebrity, the Oprah Winfrey of her day, according to Professor Gates. She goes to London. She's given the key to the city. She meets the Duke and Duchess. She meets Franklin. Everyone acclaims her genius except Jefferson. And in his notes on the state of Virginia, he, in a really grotesque chapter that infamously expresses the view that in Phyllis Wheatley's poetry is beneath contempt because, he says, black people can't write good poetry because they're intellectually inferior. And then he says, this is just a suspicion. I wish I were proven wrong. But in Rome, slaves were white. And so the poetry of Terence is good, but Wheatley's poetry is bad because she's black. It's just shocking. And it shows, again, a level of racism that neither Jefferson or neither Washington nor Franklin nor the many others who acclaimed her genius displayed. So that's Jefferson, and it is an unfortunate blot on his legacy. At the same time, I'm here in Virginia, and we're here to celebrate the Jefferson's greatest achievement. And he put 3 on his tombstone: the Declaration, founding UVA, and the Virginia Bill for establishing religious freedom. And for my money, of the 3, it was the Virginia Bill that is his most shining achievement. The Declaration, of course, establishes the American creed in words more perfect than anyone else expressed it. It's basically a rewrite of Mason's Virginia Bill on religious freedom, which Jefferson had next to him, along with James Wilson's bill for establishing the extent of limitations on legislative authority in Britain, which Jefferson also had. Jefferson always said, the Declaration wasn't anything novel. I was just summing up common wisdom as expressed in the public writers of the day, such as Aristotle, Cicero, and Sidney and Locke. But the Virginia Bill was an expression of the shining power of the unalienable rights of conscience in a way that was unique to Jefferson and central to the achievement of American freedom. And when at the Constitution Center, we opened a new gallery devoted to the First Amendment, at the front of the gallery are 2 documents, the facsimile, because the original is here: Jefferson's Bill for Religious Freedom and Louis Brandeis's great opinion in Whitney versus California. Brandeis, my First Amendment hero, had Jefferson's bill by his side in 1926 when he wrote the great Whitney versus California concurrence, which established our modern doctrine of the First Amendment. And Brandeis, who was a great Jeffersonian, had reread Jefferson over the summer of 1926. He reread Jefferson's letters and the Virginia Bill, and he tracks it almost word by word and paragraph by paragraph. And I want to just give you the main points because we're here to celebrate the Virginia Bill, and it's Jefferson at his best. So Jefferson drafts the bill in 1777, and remember the background. There are religious tests for dissenters in Virginia who are required to support the established Anglican Church. Quakers and Jews and other dissenters can be denied the freedom to marry or have custody. And Jefferson wants not only to disestablish the Anglican Church, but also remove criminal punishment for dissent and prohibit compelled support for religion of any kind. And he concludes that because freedom of conscience is a fundamental right, government can regulate overt acts against peace and order, but it lacks the power to intrude into the field of opinion. And he gives 4 reasons why freedom of conscience is central and why the government can't constrain it. First, that it's an unalienable right because people can only think for themselves. They have the power to think as they will and speak as they think, as Jefferson said, quoting Tacitus, the great Roman historian, who's his favorite author. Jefferson says at one point, "I've given up newspapers for Tacitus, and I feel much better in the morning." It's excellent advice. And he thinks out of all the writers on the reading list of all, Tacitus is the greatest, and Tacitus came up with that great defense of freedom of speech, which John Locke also quoted as central, as did Spinoza. So first, freedom of conscience is an unalienable natural right. Second, it makes representatives accountable to we the people. Third, it's necessary for the discovery and spread of political truth and the rejection of falsehood. And fourth, it allows the public discussion necessary for democratic self-government. Let me focus, I won't give you all the reasons, but I want to focus on the first, which is that freedom of conscience is an unalienable right. Because in Jefferson's first draft, not the one upstairs, but I learned just this morning that the original first draft is lost, begins with these golden, shining words. Listen to this. This is Jefferson in his first draft. "Well aware that the opinions and beliefs of men depend not on their own will, but follow involuntarily the evidence proposed to their minds," Jefferson wrote, "God hath created the mind free and manifested his supreme will, that free it shall remain by making it altogether insusceptible of restraint." That's a self-evident truth. You can't control someone else's thoughts. You can't entirely control your own. You have the power to reflect on them and to choose whether to moderate your immediate first impulses with the powers of reason. But your thoughts are involuntary sensations presented to your reasoning mind, as Jefferson put it, and therefore you can't alienate or surrender to someone else the power to control your thoughts. And now we understand why freedom of conscience is the central unalienable right. So what's an unalienable right? We're all born in a state of nature, says John Locke and believe the Enlightenment founders. And when we move to form a civil government or civil society, we alienate or surrender to government certain rights in order to get greater security and safety of the rights we've retained. We alienate the right to punish violence, and we alienate the right to control property because you need to exchange and alienate property to give it value, and to enforce contracts, you have to punish infractions. That's why property is an alienable natural right, and that's why Jefferson didn't say life, liberty, and property. For generations, people have assumed that when Jefferson said the pursuit of happiness, not property, it was because property and happiness are synonyms. They mean the same thing. Not at all. Property is an unalienable right because you have to alienate it to give it value. Happiness is unalienable because it's rooted in conscience. The right to pursue happiness is a synonym for what Jefferson meant when he said freedom of conscience. And I can't alienate to you the power to control my thoughts, even if I want to, because they're rooted in our reason, and reason, by definition, is unalienable. The shining faith in reason that suffuses these thinkers is embodied in the idea of conscience as unalienable, and that's why the Virginia Bill of Religious Freedom is so unbelievably inspiring. That was too radical for the Virginia Assembly, that sentence that I just read, and they took it out and began with the next sentence, but it just exemplifies Jefferson's great, shining contribution to liberty, and that's why it's such an honor to be here in Virginia. All right, I think I should stop, but I want to say a few things. First, we're in very serious times now, and our country is polarized, and the shining faith in reason that suffused Jefferson and Madison and all of the framers, the belief that we could use our powers of reason to moderate and modulate our unreasonable passions and emotions is now under siege, as we're more polarized politically than at any time since the Civil War, and we're retreating into filter bubbles and echo chambers on social media that seem the antithesis of the reasoned deliberation that the founders had in mind. Madison, at the end of his life, had great faith in a new media technology, the broadside press. And he believed that when this great new technology would allow things like the Federalist Papers to be printed in the newspapers and citizens would debate them, as they did here in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, one of the most important of the ratifying conventions, where giants like like James Madison and John Marshall and Edmund Randolph are on one side arguing for ratification, and the anti-federalists include Patrick Henry, imagine having him as an opponent, and George Mason, who refused to sign the Constitution because it didn't contain a Bill of Rights, and unlike Randolph, who also hadn't signed, but concluded that on balance it should be ratified with the addition of a Bill of Rights, Mason remains an opponent in the ratifying convention. So it's really close, and it might have gone the other way. And had New York not ratified, it's not clear what it would have happened, and they got the news and so forth. But it's an astonishing collection of giants. And for Madison, the whole success of the experiment comes in the fact that citizens in Virginia and around the country can read the Federalist Papers in the newspaper, discuss them with the representatives to the convention, and after thoughtful, slow deliberation, reason can slowly diffuse across the land. And Madison is also optimistic about the large size of America, which means that it'll be hard for mobs to mobilize, and by the time they do, they'll get tired and go home. And it all comes with a great faith in the ability of our leaders and journalists, who Madison calls a new class of enlightened statesmen and citizens. He calls them the literati. And he thinks that guided by the calm, cooling balm of the literati, a kind of, Atlantic magazine editors, citizens will read the Federalist Papers. They'll slowly and thoughtfully deliberate with their representatives. The representatives will deliberate in the conventions, and reason will slowly diffuse across the land. All right, even to describe this Madisonian hope is to show how far we've fallen from Madison's dream, and in many ways, of course, we're living in Madison's nightmare, as posts on social media travel further and faster than those based on reason, and we're just amusing ourselves to death with these darn devices. And the central challenge that we face, I think, is that we're not reading anymore. We're not reading books and texts and thinking before we tweet. And this isn't just the least privileged among us. The most privileged among us are not reading, and I can testify to that because I'm addicted to this device. And I found myself getting out of the habit of deep reading and not reading for stuff that wasn't related to my immediate deadlines, or browsing the newspapers and convincing myself that I was, informing myself and doing my job. And that was the real takeaway for that COVID reading for me. It got me back into the habit of deep reading. Just that experience of losing yourself in a book for an hour or two, not for any instrumental purpose. I didn't expect to write a book about this, but just for its own sake, is the pursuit of happiness. It's learning and growth and being a lifelong learner, which is another definition of the pursuit of happiness. So my takeaway from the project, I'm no longer getting up 2 hours early to read moral philosophy. I can share. I'm not always catching the sunrise either, although I try to, and there's nothing more beautiful in the world than a sunrise. And you can do it now because it's rising at about 7:20 these days here on the East Coast, and it's just the most exultant joy to see a sunrise and to set aside time in the morning for reading and reflection. So my new rule is, when I get up, I'm not allowed to browse or surf until I've read. And I do read on the screen because it just excites me so much that all the books in the world are on my Kindle. I think about Adams and Jefferson wondering whether they could have access to one book, and think of Frederick Douglass. I have to share this with you. What was the moment when Frederick Douglass felt that he was most enslaved? It wasn't only when he was forced to continue his servitude, but when his wicked master forbade him from learning how to read. He felt at that moment the master was trying to control his mind. But you can't control the mind because the mind must be free. So what did Douglass do? He went onto the streets of Baltimore and he bought reading lessons with bread. He paid guys to teach him how to read with bread. Kids were his age. And then with bread, he bought a book, and it was called The Columbian Orator, and it included selections from classical moral philosophy, from Cicero, from Aurelius, and a dialogue on slavery, where a slave argues for his freedom, and that experience convinced Douglass to become the greatest freedom fighter of his time. And it was all because of the transformative power of reading. And then after the war and after the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments, he became an evangelist for the power of deep reading and education and insisted on equal access of education for all. So my goodness, friends, if Frederick Douglass, enslaved, buying a book, I saw the original, I gave a talk and David Blight, the Douglass biographer, brought it out. It's this little book that was the most popular textbook of its time. Douglass wasn't unique. Millions of copies sold. Just little excerpts were enough to inspire Douglass to change the world. If he can do that every, if making those sacrifices to read inspired all of his greatness, I can have the discipline to swipe left rather than right and to read rather than browse. So that's what I do in the morning. I'm not allowed to browse or surf until I've read. It's definitely a habit, a new life hack that I picked up. I've just finished a new book after another year of, 2 years of reading and writing. It's on how the battle between Hamilton and Jefferson defined all of American history. It's such an exciting story, and I can't wait to share it with you. And it's really been meaningful to travel around talking about this experience I've had, and all over the country, people are resonating to the message because we all know we're addicted to these devices, and people share their own morning experiences. Some of them read, some people read, others set aside time in the morning for prayer or for other creative work like poetry or music or meditation. But just getting off the darn devices and doing deep reading and deep listening to beautiful music, or is in the spirit of the classical understanding of the pursuit of happiness, which has to do with viewing life not as a final destination, because none of us will become perfect, but it's possible to become more perfect by being lifelong learners. So that's what I learned, and so looking forward to all of our learning together about America, about the American idea of liberty, equality, and democracy, how we lived up to it and how we fell short, and the transformative power of learning about history and deep reading. Thank you so much. Yes, please.
Yeah. Oh, is this on? Okay. We would love to take some questions if anyone has questions. And if you don't mind, I'll pass you the mic so that everyone can hear. Would you mind passing that?
Wow.
There you go.
Thank you so much. That was one of the most profound and insightful talks on political history and ethics that I've ever heard, and I'm grateful for having been here today. I'm a member of a local group called RVA Indivisible. On February 20th, we're going to host a screening of a documentary called God and Country. We're going to host it at Studio 23 in Manchester. God and Country is a documentary film produced in part by Rob Reiner that's about the rise of Christian nationalism. I saw it and I was shocked by the implications of the rise of this movement, Christian nationalism. I'm wondering if you would have any comments about the dangers and the nature of this movement and what it could mean for our democracy.
Well, it's an important question. First, I have to say, at the National Constitution Center, we take our nonpartisan mandate very seriously, and I begin all of our programs by reciting the congressional mandate, which was during the bicentennial when the Constitution Center was created. We're supposed to disseminate information about the Constitution to increase awareness and understanding of the Constitution among the American people on a nonpartisan basis. So we don't talk about political issues, talk about constitutional issues, and bring together liberals and conservatives to explore areas of agreement and disagreement. I don't know enough about Christian nationalism broadly defined to be able to generalize about it, and would want to, talk about particular claims or particular manifestations of it. However, I can say that on the nationalist right and on the progressive left, there are those who reject the American idea, defined as liberalism, defined as the ideals of limited government, natural rights, and government by consent. And to the degree that that can take the form of rejecting a centerpiece of the American Constitution, which here in Virginia is rooted in Jefferson's Bill for Establishing Religious Freedom, and can attempt to establish anything resembling an established church, or the claim that one sect or one Christian denomination should be able to dictate to other citizens things that would violate their freedom of thought or action. That's a violation of our natural rights of freedom of conscience. That's the whole point of Jefferson, why it's so important. And I will say that there are those on the nationalist conservative wing who don't share Jefferson's views about freedom of conscience. His views on separation of church and state, of course, are contested. He was both a deist and I guess you could say a more extreme separationist than some of the other founders, including, there are many more conventional Christians, including Washington and Benjamin Rush and so forth. And the question of what the Establishment and Free Exercise Clause means is complicated. This is a complicated issue, and there are generally good arguments before the Supreme Court on both sides of many of the free exercise and establishment issues before the court today. So I'm not suggesting that the complete separationism is the only answer. But broadly, to reject the principles of the Virginia Bill on Religious Freedom, which some do today, I believe is inconsistent with natural law. Because I agree with Jefferson that these are self-evident truths, that the mind must be free, and any attempts by the state to coerce or dictate what shall be orthodox in matters of faith or politics, as Robert Jackson said so beautifully in the West Barnett case, violates our natural rights. So I don't think this was just some esoteric view of Jefferson. I think he was stating a self-evident truth, and it's rooted in classical moral philosophy, which insists that we have not only a right, but a duty, a divine duty to align with the divine law of the Creator, which is self-evident, which has to do with following reason, rather than accepting any claim based on dogma or authority. It's a form of monkish superstition, as Jefferson said, to try to dictate to someone else the power to think based on your dogma. It is completely inconsistent with the views that Jefferson articulated so strongly in the religious bill. So those are my views.
Thank you. What brings me here today is my COVID reading project, which has been on Lincoln. And I came away most impressed with Lincoln's second inaugural and some of the events of the last few weeks of his life, including and especially his coming to Richmond on April the 4th. And the way, and my thesis is that his walk through Richmond and through City Point showed us how to live the second inaugural. And I think, considering that all together, Lincoln showed us a way to live out or practice politics and religion in the kind of secular republic that that was a Jeffersonian democracy, especially in the Bill for Religious Freedom here that we celebrate today. Would you have any comments to agree or disagree with that being Lincoln living out Jefferson's statute.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And what a meaningful, important COVID reading project you had. And I can't wait to read your reflections on it. Lincoln considered himself always a Jeffersonian. This is what I learned in this new book on how Hamilton and Jefferson have been invoked at every point in American history. And it's so striking that Lincoln, whose mentors are Henry Clay, the founder of the Whig Party, and who really admires nationalists like Webster and Marshall, says, I've never had a thought politically that didn't stem from the Declaration of Independence. All honor to Jefferson, he said, who understood the transcendent, self-evident truth that all men are created equal. Based on his reading of the Declaration and of Madison's notes on the Constitutional Convention, which are just released in 1840, Lincoln concludes that the Constitution was a glorious liberty document rather than a pro-slavery document, a conclusion Frederick Douglass also reached, and that it's a libel on the founders, as Douglass said, to say that they endorsed slavery. And because he always believes that with the Declaration as his touchstone, that slavery must be viewed as immoral, that's why Lincoln stands in front of Independence Hall in 1861 on his way to his inauguration, and in front of Independence Hall announces, I've never had a thought politically that didn't stem from the Declaration. I'd rather be assassinated on this spot than abandon the principles of the Declaration. And it was said of, Herndon said of Lincoln that he admired only two men, Clay in his heart and Jefferson in his mind. He didn't approve of all of Jefferson's morals, but he deeply cleaved to the principles of the Declaration. And he's a passionate declarationist, and is, just as you say, he's deeply a man of faith, and his determination to end slavery is deeply rooted in his understanding of the divine. But he's completely non-sectarian about it, and would never sanction the exaltation of one sect or doctrine over another. And I think you're completely right that so Lincoln gets his stoicism from the Columbian Orator, which Douglass also read, and Murphy's English Reader. These are the best-selling textbooks of their time. Think of Lincoln, like Douglass, just reading it by the fire, teaching himself, reading the Bible, reading Shakespeare. Just, we've got to read. But he gets from that a kind of stoicism. And remember, stoicism is a faith. It's a spiritual quest. It's a claim about the nature of the divine and the Creator and of God. And Lincoln, like Douglass, shared that. So I agree, and Lincoln more beautifully encapsulates the essence of the American creed and purifies Jeffersonianism. I mean, that's the point of the new birth of freedom at Gettysburg. It's distilling the core of Jefferson, stripped free of Jefferson's own hypocrisies, into the shining ideals of the Declaration, which then Lincoln just beautifully encapsulated into the Gettysburg Address. And you trace that final last sentence, which came from Theodore Parker, a Unitarian minister who wrote in 1850, was defining the American idea, and he said it included unalienable rights and democracy, which he defined as government by all the people, for all the people, of all the people. So Lincoln is taking it directly from him. But Parker and Lincoln, through his own readings, also got it from Daniel Webster, who stood up and insisted that we are one people and that we have a government of the people. And Webster's getting it from John Marshall. The textual connection is really deep. So there's another Virginia connection. And Lincoln distills it all into one beautiful sentence, which is uniquely his own: liberty to all. He's taking the competing ideals of liberty and equality and sums them up in this idea of liberty to all. And he infuses the urgent necessity of equality, of opportunity, with the promise of liberty, and in the process perfects the American creed. Can't wait to read your book. Thank you for all that.
One last question.
It's really clear that the framers and the founding generation intended to inculcate virtue both in themselves and in the people and in the nation. But the political system they designed, I'm really curious whether you think it's designed to withstand a virtueless people and virtueless leaders, or whether it's designed to need virtuous people and virtuous leaders to succeed.
Crucially important question, and this is, a question about which the founders disagreed. Washington, in his farewell address, famously said, "Without virtue, the republic will fall," and worried about the growth of factions, and insisted that citizens had to find virtuous self-mastery, or they'd surrender to tyrants. They'd just surrender their liberty to tyrants, the way that people did in Greece and Rome. And the Greek and Roman republics fell to demagogues and tyrants like Caesar because the people voluntarily surrendered their liberty in exchange for cheap corn and cheap luxuries. And Washington and many of the framers feared that Americans would go the same way. There's a great book by Dennis Rasmussen, Fear of a Setting Sun, which notes that at the end of their lives, many of the framers were pessimistic about whether the republic would succeed because they weren't sure that citizens would find sufficient virtue. Washington, embracing the classical view, feared that people wouldn't find the Spartan asceticism which had made the revolution succeed. Hamilton thinks the executive isn't strong enough. Jefferson, rightly, is worried about the Civil War, and in 1820 fears a wolf in the night, or like a knell which wakes him, filling him with terror that the republic is going to split over slavery. Only Madison is a little more optimistic that it might succeed because he expects less. And as you say, he doesn't think you have to be like Sparta and live in common dining halls and achieve moral perfection. He's designed the Constitution in the spirit of David Hume, so that ambition will be made to counteract ambition. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Without a degree of virtue, no government would be possible. It's realistic about, and Hume thinks that you can have a clash of self-interest which will ultimately lead productively to the common good. But Madison doesn't think that you can succeed without any virtue, and that's where the newspapers are so important, and that's why he, for him and for many of them, it all comes down to public education and how successful will citizens be basically in reading. I mean, that's the gist of it. Will people be able to take the time to read and think for themselves? Because democracy requires that people make up their own minds. And he's moderately optimistic because of the great new press technologies, but he knows that it's an open question. So that's why, and that's the Enlightenment vision of virtue, not Spartan asceticism. We don't all have to be militarized soldiers of the state. We've got to take the time to read. And friends, let's do exactly that. Thank you so much.
Before we go, Luther College in the house. Will you stand up, guys? Welcome to Richmond. Luther College. And Maggie Walker. Where is Maggie Walker School? We're glad you're here. Thanks for coming, and thank you for coming. I want to, before we leave, just say two things. One, there are books available in the library at the bookstore at the Valentine, and we'll be going over right after. And always to thank the incredible staff and trustees of the Valentine who work so hard to make all of these things work. So thank you for coming, and we'll see you soon.